Well, hello, fellow teachers. Welcome to Teaching with Power. This is Ben Wilcox, and I'm so glad that you've joined me this week for our study of Genesis chapters 18 to 23 this week. And right out of the gate, I want you to know this is going to be a bit of a longer study this week. There was just so many great principles to choose from that I really had trouble letting them go. And still, there are so many other things that I could have included in these chapters. But that's just the nature of the scriptures. They give us so much to feast on that there's always going to be plenty of leftovers for future feasts. So I've painfully had to pull out the spiritual Tupperware in order to store some of the principles away for the future. But if the video seems extra long this week, I just encourage you to break it up over a couple of days rather than watching it all at once if you prefer. And maybe do the Abraham principles one day, and then the Lot and Hagar principles the next. Either way, I hope the things that we do cover will help you to decide as a teacher what truths you feel that your students most need in their lives. And then I promise you, next week isn't going to be quite so long. There's just not as much material in the next week's lesson. But if you're ready, grab your scriptures and your marking pencils. It's time to dig deep. And for an icebreaker, I like to get my students thinking about tests. And so I ask a discussion question. What kind of tests do you prefer or dread most? And why? And then I give them some options to choose from. Pop quizzes, final exams, multiple choice tests, essay tests, short answer, true-false. Personally, I probably go against the general trend by admitting that I actually like essay tests better than multiple choice, because there's only one right answer when it comes to multiple choice. But an essay leaves things a little bit more open, and I just feel I perform better in the realm of the subjective rather than the objective. But you might also want to ask them, what's the hardest test they've ever taken? Now, I think that most of us would probably prefer just to take no test at all as an option. But that's not really realistic, is it? Tests are a fact of life. School tests, job interviews, professional evaluations, physical performance tests, and even worthiness interviews are all types of tests that we've got to face in this life. And those that spend their lives running from tests will probably find themselves weak, unproductive, and aimless in life. Well, last week, we focused much more on the giving, promising nature of God. Remember how we looked at God's side of the Abrahamic covenant and how extensive it was? Well, this week, we're going to take a look at a different side of God's character. Because we not only believe in a gracious, loving, and forgiving God, but we also believe in a testing God, a proving God. We know that one of the major purposes of mortality, as we learned in Abraham 3, is, and we will prove them herewith, to see if they will do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them. It's in Abraham 3:25. And I ask you right now to ponder some of the tests that God has caused or allowed you to experience in life. What sacrifices have you been asked to make? What trials have you been allowed to undergo? What tests of faith have you faced? One of the biggest questions of life that we all need to figure out is, can I learn to love and trust the testing God as much as I do the giving God? Because as Joseph Smith once taught, you will have all kinds of trials to pass through, and it is quite as necessary for you to be tried as it was for Abraham and other men of God. And God will feel after you, and He will take hold of you and wrench your very heartstrings. And if you cannot stand it, you will not be fit for an inheritance in the celestial kingdom of God. God intends for all of us to be tested in this life. And apparently, Abraham is the poster child for that truth. So let's see what we can learn about being tested and passing tests from Abraham today. It's going to be our teacher. And perhaps something from the life of Abraham can help you and I in our own tests. And we're going to do this by examining two of the major tests of Abraham. I think that when we contemplate the testing of Abraham, our minds instantly go to the sacrifice of Isaac's story. But that was not the only test of Abraham. There was another test he faced, together with his wife Sarah, that I feel must have been as equally as trying, and maybe even more than that one. So let's begin with that test first. And I believe that making a timeline might help us to understand this first test a little better. And you could do this as a handout if you like, and have your students either fill it out on their own first, or you could just walk them through it together as a class. We're first introduced to the test in Genesis chapter 11, verse 30. What is it? Sarah is barren. She had no child. And I think, oh, poor Sarah. That's the way she's introduced. That's the first thing we learn about her, that she can't get pregnant. But I'll tell you, by the end of the story, we're going to learn that there is so much more to this woman than that. This is going to be a major trial for both Sarah and Abraham. And it's a major trial for many couples still today. But perhaps this test is heightened for Sarah and Abraham when placed against the backdrop of the promise that God makes them. And where does that promise first appear? Well, we saw it last week in Abraham 2, verses 9 through 11. And there, Abraham learns that he would have both spiritual and literal seed. He would be considered the father of many, and therefore Sarah the mother of many. So now how old are he and Sarah at the time that this promise is first given? And we don't know. But the first place that we see a mention of age is in Abraham 2, verse 14. And we know how old Abraham is when he leaves Haran. He's 62. And we know from later verses that Sarah is 10 years younger than Abraham. So Abraham's 62 and Sarah is 52. Now at that point, are those ideal childbearing years? Not really. I suppose it's possible that even nowadays, though not very likely by natural means, a woman still possibly could get pregnant at age 52. And keep in mind that we don't exactly know how long before Abraham left Haran that this promise is made. Could have been much earlier. But we know, either way, that by age 62, the promise has not yet been fulfilled. And I think that we also might want to keep in mind that it's possible that the way that they measured years back then may not be the same way that we measure them today. Perhaps these aren't solar years that we're talking about. But the next time we see the promise is in Genesis 12:2. This is the first time we see the promise of seed in the Genesis version. And verse 4 tells us that Abraham is 75 years old when he leaves Haran. So there's a bit of a discrepancy between the Pearl of Great Price version and the Genesis version. But either way, we can say that we've gotten to age 75, with Sarah being 65, and still no child. And what do you think's going on in their minds at that point? Wow, I sure thought the promise would be fulfilled by now. How is this going to work? You ain't getting any younger here. Are you sure this is going to happen, Lord? And when? And maybe shadows of doubt begin to creep in on the periphery of their faith. But they hold faithful to the promise. God said it was going to happen, so we believe it's going to happen. But then time just continues to pass. Day after day, month after month, year after year. Decade after decade. And I'll pause here to ask if you've ever been tested in this way. This is the long-term kind of test, the endurance test. Are we able to maintain our faith over long periods of time? And the next time we see the promise is in Genesis 13, 15 through 16, which says, "For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered." So God continues to assure them that they will be parents. And I can see them responding, "When? How, Lord?" But there's no explanation, just the promise. Now, we don't know their ages at this point in particular, but some considerable time has passed. And after that promise, more time will pass. So much so that we have this very interesting conversation between the Lord and Abraham in chapter 15. Abraham says, "Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? And the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir." So you can see that he's starting to question how this is all supposed to work. He's saying, "Okay, Lord, I don't have a child, but there is this servant in my house, my steward, Eliezer. He has a son, and in a way, he could be considered my heir. He was born in my house. He lives under my protection. Is that how the covenant's going to be fulfilled?" It's almost like he's trying to help the Lord keep his promise. And I really do love that about Abraham here. He seems to be okay with that scenario. His faith is such that he's open to alternate possibilities of fulfillment. I'm sure to him that's not the ideal circumstance. It's not what he expected. It's not what he wanted. But he's open to the idea. He's willing to accept the Lord's promise, being fulfilled in an unexpected, less than desirable way. It's great faith. But no, the Lord says, "This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir." And he brought him forth abroad, and said, "Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them." And he said unto them, "So shall thy seed be." So no, Abraham, that's not how this promise is going to be fulfilled. Let's get more specific here. One that is thine own heir, that comes directly from you, is how this promise is going to be realized. I know that you and Sarah are getting old, but I'll keep my promise. And once again, I picture Abraham thinking, "Okay, but when and how?" God doesn't answer those questions. He just says, "Trust me, Abraham, it'll come." And Abraham's response in verse 6, "And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness." He trusts in God without knowing the particulars. And that's a really tough kind of faith to maintain. Even when it seems the Lord is delaying the blessing, even when it seems highly improbable that it can be fulfilled, Abraham believes. And don't forget Sarah here. Sarah is just as big a part of this test as Abraham. She too is willing to accept an alternate, less than ideal fulfillment of the Lord's promise. For her, it gets to the point where she basically accepts the fact that she is not going to be the one through which the promise is going to be kept. She couldn't physically be the parent of a child, but Abraham still could. He just needed someone younger to have a child with. And so she suggests Hagar as a solution. And wow, what amazing faith and dedication to God she must have had to do that. You can imagine how hard of a decision that must have been for her. Abraham doesn't bring this idea up. It's Sarah. And we do get a timestamp for this one. Look at 16:3. Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. So Abraham is 85, making Sarah 75. Most assuredly past childbearing years. And when Ishmael is born, Abraham is 86, as it says in 16:16. So for Abraham, at least, the promise is fulfilled. He does have an heir now. Now go to chapter 17, verses 15 through 17. And how old is Abraham now? 100, making Sarah 90. And the Lord reiterates his covenant with Abraham in the following verses. But look what he adds here. And God said unto Abraham, As for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. And I will bless her, and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. Then Abraham fell upon his face and laughed, which the JST changes to rejoiced. That's going to be significant later. And said in his heart, Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, that is 90 years old, bear? This is just too good to be true. He rejoices that the promise will not only be fulfilled through Ishmael, but also through his beloved Sarah. And at that age 90, this is beyond the realm of the unlikely. We firmly planted our feet in the realm of the impossible, the realm of the miraculous, which we all know is a realm that God can work in. Sarah, he assures, is going to have a baby. He promises. And then it seems like more time goes by. Now, it's not a lot of time because she will have Isaac within the next year. But it doesn't come immediately after that conversation with Abraham, because we still have 4 chapters before it actually happens. Perhaps to keep them going in their faith, in chapter 18, 3 holy men visit Abraham and Sarah and reiterate the promise. And they said unto him, Where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, Behold, in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said unto Abraham, Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child, which am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laugh not, for she was afraid. And he said, Nay, but thou didst laugh. Now this is sometimes pointed to as an indication of a lack of faith on Sarah's part. I don't think so. When it says that she laughs, I think that we can retranslate that, like we did with Abraham, to she rejoiced. It's not a laugh of, yeah, right, but a laugh of, this is too good to be true. Is that possible? Will I really have a son? But the question of the Lord is still a good one for all of us to answer. Is anything too hard for the Lord? What's the answer to that question? No, nothing is too hard for the Lord. With God, all things are possible. If God wants a sea to part, what's going to happen to the sea? It'll part. If God wants a blind man to receive his sight, the blind is going to see. If God wants a man to walk on water, man will walk on water. And if God wants a 90-year-old woman to have a baby, what's going to happen? A 90-year-old woman is going to have a baby. Nothing is too hard for him. Do we believe that? Sarah did. In fact, in what I call Paul's Hall of Faith, instead of the Hall of Fame, in Hebrews 11, Sarah is highlighted as an example of great faith. Hebrews 11:11. Through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed, and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. So Sarah's not an example of doubt at all, but faith, great faith. So she laughs or rejoices. In fact, that's what the name Isaac means in Hebrew, to laugh or to rejoice. And she does. When? Genesis 21, verses 1 through 3. And the Lord visited Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare to him, Isaac, to laugh. They passed the test, the endurance test. This was a 40 years or more kind of test for Abraham and Sarah. But they believed. And perhaps the most beautiful tribute to Abraham and Sarah comes from Paul in Romans 4:16 through 22. Therefore, it is of faith that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations. Before him whom he believed, even God, who quickeneth the dead and calleth those things which be not as though they were, who against hope believed in hope, that he might become the father of many nations, according to that which was spoken, so shall thy seed be. And being not weak in faith, he considered not his own body now dead, when he was about 100 years old, neither yet the deadness of Sarah's womb. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully persuaded that what he had promised, he was also able to perform, and therefore it was imputed to him for righteousness. Do you see all the great phrases in there? He staggered not at the promise. He was strong in faith. He was fully persuaded that what God had promised, he was able to perform. And then my favorite phrase in that whole set of verses, who against hope believed in hope. He and Sarah had the kind of faith that still believed when all hope was truly past, when only a miracle could have made that promise possible. Against all odds, they kept their faith. What's the great message of this first test of Abraham and Sarah? Maybe I'd word it like this. When it seems the Lord's promises have not yet been fulfilled in our lives, if we maintain our faith and hope and wait patiently for God to fulfill, those promises will be fulfilled in His time, and we will rejoice. Miracles will occur. Even the impossible can happen. All things that God promises will happen as He has said, as He has spoken. Now, I believe that we too are going to be proven in this way. We will probably all experience long-term endurance or God's timing tests. God is a promising God, but those promises aren't always filled in the way or at the time that we would prefer. I'm sure Abraham and Sarah would have preferred to have that promise fulfilled in their 30s or 40s, but not their 90s. And can we have faith like theirs? We live in an immediate gratification kind of world. Fast food, 24/7 online shopping, entertainment on demand, and all the answers of the world's wisdom right at our fingertips. So how do we often react when the solutions to our problems or the fulfillment of God's promises don't come on our timetable? Do we lose faith? Do we get frustrated with God? Do we give up on the promises? Or can we be like Sarah and Abraham and judge him faithful who had promised, and against hope, believe in hope? Perhaps one of the hardest tests we'll ever have to pass in this life is the one that requires us to trust in God's timing. Now, like in the scriptures, have you ever been tried in this way? And if you have, what has helped you to believe in hope, even against all hope? Maybe it's the righteous single sister who believes in the promise of a covenant spouse, even if that doesn't come until the millennium. Maybe it's the humble teenager or investigator who patiently prays and waits for a confirmation of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon and the church. Maybe it's the widower who waits patiently in faith to be reunited with their beloved spouse at the resurrection. Maybe it's the family who faithfully pays their tithing even when they continue to struggle financially. And maybe it's all the faithful disciples of Christ who trust in his glorious return while struggling to live righteous in a wicked world. These endurance tests may be the hardest ones we'll ever have to pass. Yes, the intensity of the sacrifice of Isaac tests will also be great. But this one may have been even tougher for Abraham. I mean, whose strength and will do you think is tested more? The 100-meter sprinter or the marathoner? Both of those things are difficult feats to perform. But which do you think is the greater test? I believe it's the one that you have to doggedly fight for to maintain over weeks and months and years and maybe even decades, like Abraham and Sarah here. But for us, as well as them, the promises are assured. When God makes a promise, he keeps it. The fulfillment will come. Now to the other kind of test that we're going to most certainly face in this life. And I would call this the intensity test. Abraham faced both. And the intensity test is going to come in Genesis chapter 22. And it came to pass that after these things, that God did tempt Abraham, which means that he tested, or he proved Abraham. Look at the footnote. And said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. Love that response. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. Now, to help your students visualize the story, there's a wonderful little film that the church produced a number of years ago that depicts the story of Abraham and Isaac very poignantly, entitled Akedah, which means the binding. And it's really well done. And I know this video is suggested in the manual as well. But I feel it really captures the turmoil and emotion of this test of Abraham's. So I recommend it highly. And one of the things I feel that it gets right is the age of Isaac. In art, Isaac is often depicted as being a very young child, toddler even. But he would have at least been a young man by this point, which emphasizes the fact that Isaac was a willing sacrifice himself. This was not only a test for Abraham, but for him too. I don't think Abraham had to wrestle him down or sneak up on him, But Isaac would have come to an understanding of what was being asked of his father and him, and given himself willingly. And I believe the movie also depicts that aspect of the story well, too. So I invite you to watch Akedah, and I'll provide a link to it here, with these two questions in mind. Why do you think this request would have been particularly hard for Abraham? And two, why do you think the Lord asks Abraham to do this? Question number one, why do you think this would have been particularly hard? And before we answer that, I have to begin by saying, what a terrible test. And I know we tend to try and sterilize the story a little, but to make it more acceptable to us. But man, is this ever a tough thing to swallow? I almost want to look at heaven and say, really? Was this really necessary to test his faith? He's already been tested. He's such a good man. And yeah, we'll talk about why I think this story is in here and why I believe it did happen this way and needed to. But boy, is this ever an intense, difficult thing to ask of somebody. For so many reasons. For one, the obvious one, this is his child. Abraham must have had a deep and great love for his boy. So can you think of anything more horrific than being asked to sacrifice your own child? I mean, it's hard enough for parents to lose a child through accident or sickness. But can you imagine having to be the one to take their life? What kind of a burden would that be to carry? One, too heavy for most, too heavy for me. Then this would be especially harder for Abraham because Isaac was the promised child, the one that he had waited decades for, the one through whom he had been so sorely tested to receive in the first place. Isaac was the covenant child. But what else would have made this hard? What do you say to Sarah? How is Abraham going to explain this to her? When would you tell her? Before the sacrifice or after? I'd wait until after. And it seems from the scriptures that's what he does. But can you imagine his thoughts as he's walking to Mount Moriah? How am I going to explain this? Another thing that would have made this hard, has Abraham ever experienced something similar to this in his own life? Does this picture ring any bells? What had Abraham's father done to him? The scenario looks oddly familiar. Abraham had been through that exact same thing. He's been on that altar. He must have had a deep aversion to the idea of child sacrifice through his own personal experience. And now God's asking him to do it to his own son? Also, the place of sacrifice is 3 days away. If the Lord had just asked him to do it right there, right then I imagine the test would have been a little easier to bear. But 3 days? Can you imagine what he must have been thinking during those 3 days as they're walking to Mount Moriah? With nothing to do but think and walk, think and walk, think and walk, and look at his beloved son. Then it would have been agonizing. Another thing to consider, the Lord gives him no apparent explanation for the request. If he had told him, then that would have made it easier, right? But he doesn't tell him that it's a test of faith. He doesn't tell him that there's going to be a ram in the thicket. He doesn't tell him that this was in similitude of his only begotten. Nothing, just the inexplicable and unthinkable request on its own. So to call this an intense test is an understatement. This is an incredibly, phenomenally, extremely deep and intense test. And yet, what does Abraham do? He packs up his things He gets Isaac ready, says goodbye to Sarah, and off he goes on this 3-day journey. And I really like the way that it's written here in the scriptures. Notice all the ands. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son and clave the wood for the burnt offering and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. All of those ands really slow us down as we read. Now that's purposeful in the author. It gives the impression of difficulty, struggle, a prolonged, laborious intensity. Jump to verse 6. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. Then this heartbreaking verse. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? How do you answer that question? How do you not break into tears at that moment? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. What keeps Abraham going at this point? What takes him to the point of the unthinkable? It's faith. Deep faith. An intense faith to match the intensity of the test. Perhaps he trusted that God would stop the sacrifice. Perhaps he believed that God could provide another child for him in the future. Or perhaps he even believed that God could do the impossible, in this case as well. His first test had already taught him that principle. God can do the impossible. And look what Paul tells us. By faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. So, wow, that thought was what comforted him. He had such deep faith that he believed that even if he did kill Isaac, God could raise him from the dead. If God could work the impossible at the birth of Isaac, he could most assuredly do so with his death. And so he raises the knife. And we all know what happens next. And thank heavens, the angel comes to stop him. And now for our second question. Why do you think the Lord asks Abraham to do this? And there are a lot of responses that you could discuss with your class. You could discuss the famous quote from Elder Hugh B. Brown that said, Abraham needed to learn something about Abraham. Or I believe that most of you teachers are probably already aware of the symbolism of Abraham and Isaac as a type of the Father and the Son. Jacob from the Book of Mormon assures us of this intended comparison in Jacob 4:5. But for the sake of time, I'll leave that comparison to you to study and discover. And I know there are many resources available out there that could help you with that perspective, and you could have a great and meaningful discussion about what this story teaches about the experience of both the Father and the Son during the atonement. But what I'd like to focus on in this video is the nature of the test itself for Abraham and what he can teach us about sacrifice and obedience. I believe that one of the major reasons God asked Abraham to do this incredibly difficult thing, that it had less to do with Abraham and more to do with us. God asked Abraham to do this for you and me, to teach us something. At least that's how Paul explains it. After those excellent verses that we already read in Romans, the ones that said, against all hope, believed in hope, he concludes that thought by saying, now it was not written for his sake alone that it was imputed to him, but for us also, to whom it shall be imputed. In other words, this story was not just to teach Abraham something, but to teach the rest of God's children throughout all ages a message about sacrifice. Abraham's sacrifice places all other sacrifices in their proper context, or gives them proper perspective. We may wonder why God would test Abraham in such an extreme way. But it had to be extreme in order to cover all lesser sacrifices that God would ask the rest of his children over the ages. They're all covered in this. Perhaps there's something extremely difficult that God will ask or has asked of us. And perhaps we say, how could God ask me to do that? How could he ask me to give up that thing, to make that change, to experience that trial? It's too much. It's too hard. I'm not able. Perhaps in those moments we can envision God just leading Abraham over to us and standing him there in front of us and saying, look at my servant Abraham and consider what he was willing to do. I know you can do this. If Abraham could do that, I know that you could do what I'm asking of you. I blessed him in that sacrifice, and for that sacrifice, I made him able to do it. And I made you able to do this as well. If you weren't, I would not have given it to you. So, maybe the young man asks, how can God ask me to give up 2 whole years of my life to serve a mission? And God says, look to my servant Abraham. There's the member who's called to pass through an unthinkable trial, such as the death of a child, a betrayal of a spouse, a debilitating disease. And they ask, how can you expect me to go through this? And God responds with great love and empathy, look to my servant Abraham, the member who's called to serve in a difficult calling that they don't feel prepared to accept. And they say, how can you call me to this? And God responds, look to my servant Abraham. Perhaps it's the faithful member who feels same-sex attraction and asks, how can I go through my whole life feeling this but not acting on it? And God responds, look to my servant Abraham. Or maybe, consider the most difficult thing that we will all be called to sacrifice. Quite possibly the most difficult thing that God will ever require of you and I. Give up your sins, he says. All of them, the small ones and the big ones. Slay them on the altar of my commandments. Because in the end, what is it that the Lord is really seeking from us? What is it that he really wants from those sacrifices? It's not really the things sacrificed that he's after. We know from the story that God never wanted the life of Isaac, nor through all those years of animal sacrifices did he really want dead animals. What's the Lord really seeking with those requests? It's our will, our heart. It's not the time, it's not the money, it's not the effort that he wants so much. It's our will. Elder Neil A. Maxwell taught this. The submission of one's will is really the only uniquely personal thing that we have to place on God's altar. The many other things we give, brothers and sisters, are actually the things he has already given or loaned to us. However, when you and I finally submit ourselves, by letting our individual wills be swallowed up in God's will, then we are really giving something to him. It is the only possession which is truly ours to give. Abraham gave God his will. And his sacrifice will hopefully inspire all of us to make our sacrifices as well. To liken the scriptures, to help my students really personalize and apply this lesson, I sometimes like to give them this short application activity. And just give them a moment to ponder and answer the following questions, and then invite anyone who'd be willing to share, give them an opportunity to do so. Where do you sense God testing you in your life right now? In my family relationships? In my work or school responsibilities? In my health? In my faith? Or something other? What have you found most helpful in facing your tests of life? Prayer? Seeking counsel from church leaders? Fasting? Studying the scriptures? Or something else? What principle from the life of Abraham has most helped you today? God always fulfills his promises, although on his timetable. If I wait patiently upon the Lord, all will work out in the end. God is both a giving and a testing God. Both are manifestations of his love. Or knowing that Abraham was willing to sacrifice what God asked of him gives me strength to sacrifice what God asks of me. Or something else. And then an open-ended question: why was that particular principle so meaningful to you? Well, my friends, I do earnestly believe and know that we are all going to be tested in our lives, in both of the Abrahamic ways, with endurance tests and intensity tests. I hope that we can all look to Abraham and Sarah and Isaac for inspiration to face and pass those tests. I hope that we can all learn to love and trust both the giving God and the testing God. All right, moving on to some different characters in these chapters. Let's talk about Lot and Hagar. But first, Lot. So something to consider before we get going here. The story about Lot's experience in Sodom is a little disturbing in places. There are some things in the story of a sexual nature that may be uncomfortable or troubling for some. So before you teach it, consider the maturity of your audience. For our purposes here, we're not going to shy away from those more disturbing things because I feel that they're key to understanding the power of the story. It's critical that we understand the gravity of Lot's errors. And whenever I teach this story, I feel a little bit like Jacob in the Book of Mormon, who has to talk about the grievous sins of the men of his day in front of all their wives and children, those with tender, chaste, and delicate minds. And he worries about wounding those that were pure in heart. But he teaches the principles anyway. The message was that important. So as an icebreaker to the story of Lot, I like to talk about tents. Now, I'm an avid backpacker, and I've spent considerable time researching and setting up and sleeping in tents. So as a teacher, I'll usually bring in one of my backpacking tents and set it up right there in front of the class as an object lesson. And then I tell my students that I'm going to give them my top tips for pitching a tent. And here they are. Don't pitch your tent in a low place or in a wash. Because if it rains, you may end up with a river running down your back in the middle of the night. 2, before you pitch your tent, remove all rocks and sticks from under it. If you don't, you'll probably be in for a very uncomfortable night of sleep. Number 3, don't pitch your tent under any dead branches or near dead trees. Trees do fall in the forest even if you're not around to hear them. If it's windy at night, these branches and trees pose a very credible danger to your life. And then number 4, when pitching your tent, stake your tent down first. And that's something that I've only more recently learned, and I can't believe it took me this long to figure it out. I always used to put the poles in my tent first, and then try to stake it down. The problem is that if it's even just a bit windy, you're wrestling this giant parachute. But if you stake the corners down first, then, as you insert the poles, it won't get away from you. Well, the people of the Old Testament also used tents quite frequently. And Lot, Abraham's nephew, is going to make a fatal error in pitching his tent. What is it in Genesis 13:12? His error? He pitched his tent towards Sodom. Now that means he pitched his tent near Sodom or close by to it. Not in it, but nearby. And why is that a problem? Look at the next verse. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Now we often associate Sodom with homosexuality, and that was a problem there. Jude teaches us that in Jude 1:7-8. But Ezekiel does a very thorough job of telling us all of the things that made Sodom such an evil place. Ezekiel doesn't even mention their sexual sins until the very last. He says, "Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom, pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And they were haughty, and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw good." So the major sins of Sodom, besides the ones of a sexual nature, were pride, laziness, and selfishness. Why was it so foolish for Lot to pitch his tent nearby? Well, what was he and his family seeing every day they came out of their tent? What kinds of people were they associating with day in and day out? What were Lot's children experiencing as a result of being so close to attitudes and behaviors of that nature? And before moving on, I think this would be a good place for us to pause and liken the scriptures to ourselves. How might we make Lot's mistake in our day? How does a modern-day disciple pitch their tent towards Sodom? I think we pitch our tents towards Sodom to the degree in which we allow the influence of the world to seep into our homes and minds. What things might we do that allow Sodom or the world to influence us? I believe that our cell phones and television screens can often act as windows into Sodom. They allow us to peer through the tent flaps into a wicked world. I'm not saying that everything that comes from Hollywood or the internet or social media is wicked, but certainly a lot of it is. Many a disciple of Christ has been drawn into Sodom through the lure of the images, ideas, and temptations that appear on those screens. Also, the types of friends that we choose and the environments we tend to spend time in can also greatly affect our beliefs and actions. Now, we don't want to isolate ourselves completely from the world because we are meant to influence it, like we spoke last week. But when does it become a problem? When Sodom starts to pull us down instead of us lifting them up. Once we realize that we are not strong enough to lift, then for the sake of our own souls, we should probably let go of those relationships. But pitching your tent towards Sodom usually has an inevitable outcome. At the beginning, if you were to ask Lot about his decision to pitch his tent there, he might have defended himself by saying, "But it's not like I'm actually living in Sodom. I'm not doing what they're doing. I'm strong enough to withstand the temptations." And sometimes we say the exact same kinds of things to rationalize our tent pitching problems. But just look at the very next chapter, in verse 12. And what's changed? It says that he dwelt in Sodom now. Pitching your tent towards Sodom will almost inevitably lead to you living in Sodom, eventually. And Lot's attitude towards that decision doesn't seem to worry him so much at this point. In fact, go to chapter 19 and read the first 3 verses. Do you sense any anxiety or worry in Lot at this point? No, he seems pretty casual about it. If you had tried to warn him about his decision, he might have defended himself by saying something like, I don't know why you're so worried about me living here. It's not like I'm doing what they're doing. Yeah, they've got their problems, but I can still raise my family here just fine. It's not that big a deal. I can live in this environment without falling into temptation. You worry too much. We say the same kinds of things. And so he invites 3 holy men to come in and stay at his home in Sodom. But then I think Lot's attitude towards his decision to live in Sodom is going to change very quickly here. Let's read the next couple of verses, and you tell me the moment you think Lot's attitude changes.
But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot, and said unto him, Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after him, and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Now, this is one of those unsavory, uncomfortable kinds of moments in the lesson. Because when they ask him to bring out the men so that they can know them, they don't mean to socialize. If you look at the footnote, you'll understand the connotation of to know them. They want to rape them. How do you think Lot feels about his decision of moving into Sodom now? It's not so casual a concern anymore, is it? I'm sure he feels deep regret at this point. These kinds of painful moments always eventually come when we decide to pitch our tents towards Sodom. These are Sodom moments. They're the moments we realize the consequences of our foolish or casual behavior towards the world. It's the moment the person finds that they're addicted and can't stop their destructive behavior even when they want to. It's the moment they get caught in a lie and lose the trust of a cherished relationship. It's the moment the criminal gets caught. It's the moment a person loses their worthiness to attend the temple. It's the moment a parent realizes that they failed to protect their children from the sway and influence of a wicked world. It's the moment Lot realizes that he's plunged himself and his family right smack dab in the middle of an evil and dangerous location. And so what happens to Lot when he refuses to acquiesce to the people's request? Things get ugly fast. And to be clear, be sure to look at the Joseph Smith translation for verse 8. It's at the back of the Bible and will clarify what Lot is really suggesting concerning his daughters. Because if what's in Genesis is actually what Lot proposed, well, then he deserved to be destroyed in Sodom along with everybody else. But the JST clears it up nicely. So he pleads with them to not do so wickedly. And how ironic that he calls them brethren in verse 7. Are these people his brethren? People who wish to hurt or abuse his guests or daughters? They aren't friends or brethren at all. He thought they were. They seemed like it. But they never really were. And that's another sad Sodom moment for us. It's the moment when we realize our friends were never our friends to begin with. I'll never forget a beloved student who came to visit me after her first year of college. She told me about a young man who showed great interest in her and professed his deep love, but at the same time pressured her into becoming more and more intimate with him. Sadly, once he had accomplished his desire with her, he wanted nothing more to do with her and moved on to show interest in a different young lady. she painfully discovered that he was not really her friend, or her brethren, even though she saw him as such. We've got to be very careful about who we allow to influence us. So now, how do Lot's brethren react? And they said, "Stand back." And they said again, "This one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs be a judge? Now we will deal worse with thee than with them." And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. Ha ha! The great accusation of the guilty. You're judging us. That's almost always the retaliatory cry of those who are doing wrong. Well, you're just as bad because you're judging me. And don't get me wrong, being judgmental is a problem and something that we need to watch out for. But calling a sin, or warning people that we love about the potential consequences of their choices is not being judgmental. It may actually be one of the greatest manifestations of love. But luckily for Lot, he still has a chance. The holy men smite the men of the city with blindness, which gives Lot some time to do something about the situation. And they give Lot some instruction in verses 12 and 13. They say, "And the men said unto Lot, Hast thou here any besides? Son-in-law, and thy sons, and thy daughters, and whatsoever thou hast in the city? Bring them out of this place. For we will destroy this place, because the cry of them is waxen great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord hath sent us to destroy it." So Lot, get your family and all your loved ones out, and flee. Get out before the destruction comes. And Lot tries. And eventually, spoiler alert, he is going to get out. But unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. Lot does not get away unscathed. He's going to lose some things. I'd like you to take a look at the following verses and try to identify Lot's losses. What does Lot lose as a result of his decision to move to Sodom? Verse 14, verse 26, and verse 30. And Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and said, Up, get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. So we know that he's going to lose at least two of his daughters because it says sons-in-law, plural. We also know that he had some sons based on that earlier verse. So he loses them too. He tries to warn them, but they don't take him seriously. That's the danger of not taking the dangers of Sodom too seriously yourself. When the problems do come and you try to warn those you love, it may be too little too late. They won't believe you. What else will Lot lose? Verse 26, but his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. What does that mean? Does that mean that God literally turned her into a pillar of salt because she was curious about what was happening behind her? I mean, she heard all the noise and destruction, decided to turn around and take a peek, and therefore God smote her? I don't think so. That doesn't sound like the way God works to me. So we may have to go to another place in Scripture to shed some light on what really may have happened here. In Luke 17, verses 31 to 32, Jesus referred to the story of Lot's wife to warn the people of his day about fleeing the world as the second coming approached. And he says, In that day, he which shall be upon the housetop, and his stuff in the house, let him not come down to take it away. And he that is in the field, let him likewise not return back. And then to provide an example of that action, he says, remember Lot's wife, suggesting, in my mind, that she not only looked back, but that she returned back. She went back and was therefore destroyed with the rest of Sodom. Why a pillar of salt? Tradition states that Sodom was situated near the Dead Sea, a place known for its mineral and its salt content. And do we sometimes make the same kind of mistake? Are there times when we decide to return to sins or habits or lifestyles after we've already gone through the effort of leaving them? Do we allow ourselves to slowly be sucked back into inactivity or worldliness? Sometimes recent converts struggle with this and eventually never return to church. Why? Because they look back and then they return back to lose the ground that they once gained. And we have verse 30. And Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zoar. And he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. What else does he lose? His home and all his possessions. It's just him and his 2 daughters left. He doesn't even have a tent to pitch towards Sodom, or anywhere for that matter. He ends up living in a cave. Such a tragic story. It's sad. You see him there in his cave, having lost all of that. And then, you don't have to mention this if you don't want to in a lesson. You could just end the discussion right there and make the point. But you could add another loss by reading Genesis 19, verses 31 to 38. In a sense, Lot ends up losing his other 2 daughters as well. I won't go into the details here, but you could read it and see that they end up committing a very sinful act. They have a good desire, but they go about accomplishing it in a very, very wrong way. The ends don't justify the means here. But where do you think they would have gotten an idea like that? Probably by living in Sodom. So what does Lot lose for pitching his tent towards Sodom? Everything. I put it this way. Lot loses lots. That's the problem with pitching your tent towards Sodom. So what's the moral of the story? When I pitch my tent towards Sodom, when I expose myself or my family to the influence of the world, I will likely lose much. So rather than suffer the Sodom moments of life, is there a better way? The scriptures never present a problem without the solution being somewhere nearby. Rather than casually considering the influence of the world, how should we approach the dangers of Sodom? The answer comes from the holy men in verse 17. What should we do? And it came to pass when they had brought them forth abroad that he said, escape for thy life. To take this danger seriously. We can't play with fire and expect not to get burned. The things that we watch, the music we listen to, the places we go, the things we do online, the language we use, the company we keep. We should ask ourselves, am I allowing too much Sodom in my life? Look not behind thee. Don't be like Lot's wife. Don't go back. When you've left evil, leave it completely. Don't look longingly over your shoulder at the short-term pleasure of the sins of your past. After you've repented, don't return. Neither stay thou in all the plain. Don't ever even get close to those things again. Be like Abraham. Don't even take a thread's worth of Sodom. Stay as far away from the world and temptation as possible. Be like the anti-Nephi Lehis of the Book of Mormon, who buried their instruments of rebellion deep in the earth. Be committed to avoiding even the appearance of evil. And then, escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed. What's our mountain? The rock of our Redeemer? The temple, which is sometimes referred to as the mountain of the Lord? Our covenants? The commandments? Church? All of these things. Get to the mountain. There's safety there. Lest thou be consumed. The ironic thing for Lot here is that he's already consumed in Sodom. He and his family. If he had only stayed on the mountain to begin with, he may still have had his family intact. Now, I don't think that Lot was an unrighteous man. I think he was an unwise man. He may have been able to claim that he was strong enough to withstand the temptations of Sodom. And you know what? He was. He was right. He didn't become like them. He didn't give in. He was strong enough to resist. But his family wasn't. He failed, unwittingly, but foolishly, to protect his family from the influences of evil by being too casual about the danger that Sodom posed. So, to liken the scriptures, where do you feel that you've spiritually pitched your tent? Think about your habits, your media choices, your friends, the environments you put yourself in. Where's your tent? If you had to represent it visually here, where would you put it? And you might want to ask yourself, are there any influences with Sodom that you need to rid yourself of? A social media app you need to delete? Television program that you need to stop watching? Music that you should erase from your library? A bad habit you need to overcome? A sin you need to confess to your bishop? Maybe even a toxic friendship that you need to cut. I know that if we'll take that step, whatever it is, that we may escape the fate of Lot and his family. We may spare ourselves from those Sodom moments that are lurking out there in our futures. Please watch out for the world. Take its influence seriously, and let's strive to rid ourselves of its sway as much as possible and still be a power for good to those around us. The story of Lot is a cautionary tale to any who would underestimate the power and pull of the adversary and Babylon. I encourage all of us to do whatever we can to minimize its impact and fill our lives with the goodness of the gospel, as much of it as we can. Rather than pitching our tents towards Sodom, maybe we could be more like the people of King Benjamin, who pitched their tents round about the temple, every man having his tent with the door thereof towards the temple. Now that's a winning spiritual strategy. Or we can be like Abraham. It's a great foil or contrast to Lot. Remember his approach to Sodom in last week's lesson. He refused to take even a thread's worth of Sodom. He wanted nothing to do with that wicked city or anything in it. That's one of the works of Abraham that we can do. So, escape for thy life and the lives of your family. Look not behind thee, neither stay thou in all the plain, but escape to the mountain. And like those holy men promised, and like the holy men of today still promise, you will not be consumed. Now, I really struggled with the decision whether to include this lesson on Hagar. I knew it would make the lesson extra long. But in the end, I decided to include it because I think she has some unique and important truths to teach us. For an icebreaker to this section, I like to talk about difficult words to say. The following words are considered among the most difficult things to say in the English language: rural, otorhinolaryngologist, anemone, Worcestershire, and isthmus. Now, I don't even know if I got those right myself. Now, for non-native speakers of English, the list changes a little. For some reason, the word choir is one of the most difficult words for non-native speakers to pronounce. And it's not just an issue for people who are trying to learn English. Every language has its difficult words to say. For example, I don't think I ever really learned how to pronounce the Portuguese LH sound correctly. Like in the Portuguese word for advice. It's conselho. And as I say that, I'm sure my Brazilian friends out there can tell that I'm not a native speaker when I try to say that word. There are difficult words for us to say. And as difficult as it is to say those words, I don't think they're the most difficult to say. We're going to let Hagar teach us the most difficult words. Now, who was Hagar? Hagar was Sarah's maid, and later Abraham's wife. And in Genesis 16, we see Sarah suggest to Abraham that she bear children for her. Now, I know that goes contrary to our modern sensibilities of propriety. But let's be careful not to judge their culture by ours. And it works. Hagar becomes pregnant. But then look what happens next in verse 4. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. What's happening here? Perhaps Hagar's lording it over Sarah a bit. Kind of like, wow, I can get pregnant and you can't. I'm able to bear a child for Abraham. Maybe she's boasting or thinks she's better, which is certainly an unkind thing to do. We know that this was a very sensitive issue for Sarah. There's nothing she wanted more than to have a child with Abraham, but it just hadn't happened. And so Hagar is definitely in the wrong in this situation. Instead of dealing with Sarah's situation with compassion and sympathy, she treats her contemptuously or with a sense of superiority. So Sarah goes to Abraham and says, "My wrong be upon thee," which just means you should do something about this, Abraham, not that she's blaming him for the situation. "I have given my maid into thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee." And I think Abraham reacts probably like your typical male. He basically says, "Ooh, I'm not getting involved in this. You go work it out." And so he says, "Behold, thy maid is in thine hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee." So he gives her permission to confront Hagar. What happens? And when Sarah dealt hardly with her, she lets her have it. I don't think that means physically, but verbally for sure. And what do we often do when we are dealt hardly with? She fled from her face. Hagar runs away. Now, is that the best solution to resolving family conflicts? To just run away from the problem? Not usually. Running away typically doesn't solve many problems. Divorce can be a form of running away. Stonewalling can be a form of running away. Leaving home is a form of running. Disowning a child, alienating yourself from your family. Now, that's not to say that there aren't situations where you should run away. Nobody should feel obligated to remain in an abusive or toxic relationship. But we should be careful not to turn to that solution too quickly or lightly in lesser situations. Sometimes this manifests itself in ward families where people will run from fellowship in the church because of real or perceived offenses. This is often the solution people turn to when they feel that they have been dealt hardly with. But an angel is going to teach Hagar and all of us a better way. She's visited in verse 7, and look what he says. And he said, "Hagar, Sarah's maid," which I think is significant that he calls her that. "Hagar, remember that you are Sarah's maid." And then he asks her some critical questions. "Whence camest thou, and whither wilt thou go?" Those that run away don't often always consider those questions. Where am I going to go now? And she answers, "I flee from the face of my mistress Sarah." And the angel of the Lord said unto her, "Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands." The book of Genesis is a great place to learn how to deal with conflict within our families, because a lot of the families in Genesis have issues. Cain and Abel, Hagar and Sarah here, Jacob and Esau, and later we'll see major problems amongst Jacob's 12 sons. These are families with problems, but we can learn from them. I don't think any family in the church is free of conflict and difficulty, regardless of how they may appear on the outside. The message here: when we experience conflict within our families, rather than run and blame, what should we do? According to the words of the angel, what's his angelic advice? Return and submit. Don't run from the problem. Figure it out. Work it out with that person. Don't ignore it, and don't intensify it. And be willing to have a degree of humility and submissiveness. I think that means that we have to look deep inside ourselves and seek to recognize the part that we may have played in the problem. Probably a better answer Hagar could have given to the angel's question would have been, I was insensitive, and Sarah overreacted. I don't think that Sarah is completely faultless in this situation either. Problem probably stemmed from a bit of pride on the part of Hagar and jealousy on the part of Sarah. Yeah, I think Sarah had every right to be upset, but it sounds like she gets pretty angry. Perhaps she could have handled things better. And that's usually the way things happen in family conflicts. In my family conflicts. If I've ever had a conflict with my wife or one of my children, it's usually because I've been insensitive and they overreact. Vice versa. But wonderfully, Hagar does the right thing here. She listens to the angel. She does return and submit to Sarah. She's a perfect contrast to Cain, who after he receives correction, refused to return and submit. So, in my opinion, what are the hardest words in the English language to say? I think they're, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Those might be the difficult words you'll ever have to form with your lips. But it's worth it to learn how to pronounce them. Those words can bring peace and healing to our homes and families and relationships. Now, let's not leave Hagar just yet. There's another story about her that I want to take a quick look at with you. It's in chapter 21. Unfortunately, the conflict between Sarah and Hagar doesn't end there. It returns later, years later, after Sarah has Isaac. But then we learn in chapter 21, verse 9, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. If you look at the footnote for mocking, it sends you to Galatians 4:29, which tells us that perhaps this was more than just mocking. This is full-blown persecution. That competitive spirit between the moms has now transferred to the children. And Ishmael persecutes Isaac. And it must have gotten really bad, because that's the only way we can explain what Abraham does next. And I know this sounds horrible, but he sends Hagar and Ishmael away. The family splits. So perhaps this can be a bit of a balancing idea to the return and submit principle. Sometimes, perhaps the right solution is to separate. When peace can't be reached, when the negatives of remaining far outweigh the positives of returning, perhaps compromise is the next best thing. And before we judge Abraham too harshly in separating the family, take a look at verses 10 through 14. Wherefore she, Sarah, said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. He loves Ishmael. And God said unto Abraham, Let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and took bread and a bottle of water, and gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, and the child, and sent her away. And she departed, and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So this is not an easy thing for Abraham to do. He loves Ishmael. He loves Hagar. Sure of it. This is grievous to him. And notice how he doesn't let them leave until he knows through revelation that they're going to be okay. That God assures him that this is okay and that they will be well taken care of. And so Hagar and Ishmael wander out into the wilderness. Sadly, things turn dire rather quickly. and the water was spent in the bottle. And she cast the child under one of the shrubs. And she went and sat her down over against him a good way off, as it were a bow shot, for she said, Let me not see the death of the child. And she sat over against him, and lifted up her voice, and wept. This story makes me think of all those wonderful single parents out there in the church who are struggling to raise their children in the wilderness of the world. Those that have lost their Abrahams and are facing their problems alone and are feeling like their water is spent in the bottle. What happens next to Hagar is enlightening. And God heard the voice of the lad. And the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said unto her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the bottle with water, and gave the lad drink. And God was with the lad, and he grew, and dwelt in the wilderness, and became an archer. God heard her and Ishmael. That's what the name Ishmael means in Hebrew. God hears. So to all you struggling single parents out there, you Hagars, remember that God hears you and your children. God not only cares about the Abrahams and the Sarahs and the Isaacs, he also cares deeply about the Hagars and the Ishmaels of the church as well. Perhaps when a father or a mother is absent in the home, God fills in that role. My dad's a good example of this principle. He grew up in a home without a father. So his mother, my grandma, was a Hagar. And God watched out for them. He heard her and was with her and her lads. And yeah, I know there were many times when Grandma felt like the water was spent in the bottle. But whenever it got to that point, God heard her cries and helped. And I know that he'll do the same for all of you Hagars out there as well. And that's all I have for you this week. I know it was a long one. Next week will be shorter, I promise. But I'm grateful that you've taken this time to study the scriptures with me this week. If you're interested in the resources that I make, go to teachingwithpower.com and you'll find links to them. If you haven't subscribed, do that. Please share this lesson with those that you feel it could help. Thank you so much for watching. Now get out there and teach with power.